Hello and welcome to Cryptocat-Guru. Today, we are going to give you an explanation of the metaverse that will blow your mind. You will have a totally different understanding as of today. After watching the whole video, you will understand in detail what the metaverse is, what digital ownership has to do with the automotive industry, and why the invention of the baby seat is one of the most interesting comparisons to understand the metaverse. If you are new to our channel, please consider to subscribe and like our video down below. Also, feel free to comment down below to respond to your thoughts with new valuable videos. Let's start off with the definition of the metaverse. In fact, probably all of you will have already heard of the metaverse in some form and fashion, especially after Facebook basically tried to coin themselves as Meta, but also Microsoft, Roblox, Epic, and just every other company out there is now trying to figure out the metaverse strategy. So, what in fact is the metaverse and what might it mean? If you take a look at, for instance, the amount of time that we really spend online today, basically most of the time in things like social media, Twitter, Facebook, and if you also consider the fact that of the 3.2 billion people who are already playing games on a very regular basis around the world spending most of their casual evening times playing fun and exciting games, actually one might argue that we are already in a kind of metaverse. After all, what are you doing first in the morning and what are you doing before you go to bed? Very likely you're interacting with a digital device that is connecting you to some kind of virtual experience, whether this is sharing a photo on Instagram, whether this is playing a game on your iPhone or on your PC. So one could argue we are already in a kind of metaverse today. But the question is who owns this metaverse and who owns control of it? And perhaps the even bigger question is who owns your data? So let's talk a little bit about data, because today perhaps the most valuable of resources is no longer something that you take from the ground, even though it may still be precious to some. If you consider, for instance, what it really meant for the people in society before you were valuing things that were scarce by resources based on access to land, for instance, because you were able to extract resources from it. But today the world's most valuable resource is data. And what's interesting about data is that this particular resource comes from our headspace, from our ideas, from our minds in fact. And it actually comes from the scarcest of resources, which is our time, the time that we have to live on Earth here. But one of the other things that's interesting about this particular resource is that we actually don't seem to own much of it, and that's because we don't understand the value of data. But what happens today is that we give our data away freely to game companies or social platforms like Facebook and Twitter. All these spaces are blocks of information. And then actually the platforms turn it into knowledge and create a very powerful network effect, and that actually becomes a valuable thing that these platforms have. The issue, though, is for us delivering this data, what do we get for it? We think it's fun, we think it's entertaining to use it, but in reality, we get nothing for it. So effectively, we are now living in a kind of digital colonialism where actually we are farming away our data for free and we give it to the likes of the Facebook or the Epics of the game companies in the world who are making value of it. And yet here we are spending all of our time playing these free games, but actually we don't get paid for it. Is that fair? And that's because we're surrounding our data, because we don't understand what it's worth. And then a network effect is created, and that network effect is what they sell us: advertising services, products, or paid services. And it creates a scenario where today we're living in a world which basically is siloed with the data ownership in these sort of pre- or early kind of metaverses, where we don't own anything, where the users who are playing these games actually are literally serfs in the kingdom of Facebook, Microsoft, Apple, or any one of those experiences. Today, we actually don't own our data. This data is owned by them. And this is perhaps exemplified in another way by taking a look at the market caps of companies today versus at the market caps of companies basically a little over 10 to 15 years ago. And in fact, before, they were all energy companies who were focused on oil and energy for the most part. However, today the vast majority of all the top companies in the world, they look like technology companies. In fact, they are, but what they really are is data-rich companies. The $1 trillion of value comes in large part because of the fact that they're getting this resource, our data, our time, entirely free. The other issue, of course, is that you're creating a situation of a world of have and have-nots. The access of this resource, the ones who actually have access to the data and are able to manipulate and control it, are the ones who will get to benefit from this. They are in part creating a kind of unequal society that we're seeing right now. Now, why does non-fungible tokens and crypto and blockchain actually make all of this potentially different? It starts with this paradigm of data, because the non-fungible token as a platform, as a technology, actually allows the user to truly own their data. And that's because it uses blockchain, meaning that this data does not reside in a server controlled by Facebook or Epic Games. It resides in a public ledger, in a database that is owned by the commons, sort of a network that is distributed, and therefore everyone has access to it and nobody really can remove what's in there, meaning that the concept of the non-fungible token is more than just a scarce item. It is actually a scarce visual item that really confers true digital property rights upon the owner of this asset. Whether this is a painting, a cat image, a silly JPEG, or other things, you now own it, and it allows for people to create new constructions on it, because of the fact that you own it. Let us explain that a little bit. Non-fungible tokens we consider are open digital assets. And these open digital assets, they represent your data rights and they become composable on top of things in the same way that the platforms today compose on our data today. Remember, Facebook doesn't just take our data and do nothing with it. It takes our data and then it composes services on top of it and extracts value out of this composition and knows more about us and sells us advertising. It's just one example of that composability. We don't have a benefit for that composability. But now, when you have this data laid out in an open blockchain for anyone to see, you can freely compose on top of it a new product or service that actually then benefits the original owner of that asset, much like what you've seen today. In the simplest of terms, someone who created a digital piece of art has a non-fungible token and can, for instance, receive a continued royalty for having been the original creator of that asset. But I think we've seen this example of open composability in the past, and this is not just because of the fact that it's an asset. Open composability in fact started in the digital world with code, and in fact open source code is perhaps the perfect example of what open composability has done to the world of technology. And today, everything in the world is run by open source. Everything is developed on top of that, and it is the reason why the largest of corporations can no longer compete with a closed source environment, where they can basically just code themselves and sort of control the knowledge that's in there. They have to actually tap into open source because millions of coders have created the best code out there, and it's also the reason why a small startup can compete with a larger organization, because he has the ability to access all of that code that was created through the wisdom of the millions of community people who have created better code. And decomposability starts because someone may have created code for something very simple and another person takes that code and manipulates it for his own purpose and puts it back into the community so that they can also benefit from it as part of the social contract. In fact, that is the way that one can think about non-fungible tokens as well, in the fact that you can compose freely on top of it, except it is something that is now related to an asset. And what happens when you allow for open composability is essentially an ability to have an exponential ability to generate ideas and much more of a sharing environment because it's permissionless. Anyone has the freedom to manipulate that code, and the original creator of the code does not have the ability to stop them. In fact, the value of that original code increases in its utility because many more people might be creating new things on top of it. This has given birth to this incredible technological revolution and the innovation that we have seen really in the last 3 or 4 decades in an exponential manner. But there is one difference here, which has been a bit of a problem, and one of the problems is that code is something that many people don't understand. The problem is that the vast majority of the world does not know how to interpret or manipulate code, no matter what we've been trying to do in the schooling industry, and many governments and education systems are trying to promote the usage and learning of code. And yet here we are, still years and years after all of these attempts to get everyone to understand any sort of code and engineering. And we still don't do that because, for the most part, it is something that we're not necessarily comfortable with. It is effectively like learning a new language. And we know what that's like. If you don't learn the culture, learning a new language like this may not seem natural. And so inadvertently, we have created a new kind of digital elite, the one that knows how to read and manipulate code. And they're basically the new kind of group of people who have sort of a disproportionate amount of power. In fact, if you consider it a slightly different way, how much culture has code really delivered to us? The way that we interface and interact with the interfaces in the digital world, the way we sort of navigate or even socialize is a construct of code today that we're basically following based on what someone else has designed from an engineering standpoint, from a software design point. So, code really does run the world and is one of the most openly composable things in the world, but only a small number of people have benefited from this, comparatively speaking. When you take this concept into non-fungible tokens, the same element of composability, actually it broadens up. The reason why is because you don't need to know how to code to participate in culture, meaning that you can now manipulate your assets and your services on top of something that you own, as opposed to something that you have to sort of write code specifically on top in a digital context, as it has been the case with open source. So let us describe that a little bit. For instance, if we have a look at the automotive industry, selling or buying a car is only a very small part of the entire automotive ecosystem. In fact, the right way to think of non-fungible tokens in terms of open assets and deals is that they, much like in the physical world, become a platform of services and products. On top of it, a car is not just something that you buy to drive and purchase. A car has become a platform. In fact, that platform is what fuels entire economies. If you think about the way that roads are being constructed, parking lots are being created, fuel economies are being designed, drivers that are hired, mechanics that are employed. In fact, so many people are now involved in the world of automobiles simply because you have the ability to own it. And it does not need permission from the likes of Tesla or Volkswagen or Mercedes to be able to do something with it, meaning that you can now openly compose. In other words, you can now innovate independent of requiring permission from someone else and thereby also adding value. We'll give you an example that is one of our favorite ones, which is the creation of the baby seat. The baby seat actually came 3 decades after the car was first created. And we can probably guarantee you that when the car was first designed back by Henry Ford and some of the early pioneers in the car industry, they were not thinking about a transport mode for young children because, after all, young children are not likely to be able to know how to drive a car. But 30 years afterwards, a small company, the Bunny Bear Company, decided that they wanted to create a commercially great baby seat so that children could be transported comfortably and eventually safely from their destination, because cars have become much more commonplace. Now, what's interesting about this is that the creation of this product had nothing to do with sort of needing support or needing permission from the original creators of the car. It was done entirely independently. That's the first point. So, innovation was able to come on top of it, because it was an entire industry of people who owned cars. But the second thing I think, which is even more powerful, is that it led to eventual things like the seatbelt, and actually it added to the utility of the car because now the car was a device. It was a utility item that had a value to families to transport children safely, as well as bringing the adults from place to place. In other words, by adding that utility and that function, it not only made the asset more useful, it made it more valuable and also created a larger audience because now there was more utility towards it. And today, if you have a family, you cannot imagine having a car without a baby seat or support for baby seats, meaning that they both benefit of each other's value and they both created value for each other. When you consider all the industries in the physical world today, actually they all compose this way. For instance, the ability for you to own real estate and to really own a property that you live in allowed for the creation of real estate agents or interior decorators and kitchenware companies like IKEA. These are things that were only possible because we had the ability to own property. And those services that made our experiences better to own property actually then made the property in and of itself more valuable because our usefulness of this improved because of the innovation of others. And this is really the history of innovation, period, when you think about everything that's been constructed in the past. But in the digital world, everything is permissioned because the traditional closed system meant that when you play a game, that asset cannot transfer, it can only stay inside the game. And in fact, it's rented. You don't have an ownership. It belongs to the game company, and if you ever wanted to use it for something else, you must always seek permission from the platform. Essentially, it becomes restrictive and very innovation unfriendly because you always need to seek permission. But in a decentralized blockchain model, where your assets exist in what we consider the true and open metaverse, they are free to go and travel everywhere they want, much like free trade of assets and items that we have in the physical world. And because you own it, it allows for a third-party composition on top of it. For instance, if you have a virtual sword inside a game, it can be used in 5 or 6 different kinds of games, not just in your own game, or it could be used for a fractionalization service, for example. There could be a bunch of new services that people create on top of the fact that that person owns this asset. And so really what they're doing is developing and creating network effects, not just within the game itself, but within the asset itself. Meaning that every asset, much like the car example I gave earlier, becomes a platform, and in fact, the assets themselves become platforms that people can openly compose. But it is only possible if you actually own that. You can build your own experiences. You're free to sell it to someone else. You're free to collect rent and all the benefits that ownership confers upon you. And we think this is really critical. That essentially this paradigm that we've seen before, where the internet was really about information at first, and then with the advent of Bitcoin, basically it created a sort of internet of value, and now, essentially with non-fungible tokens, you have this paradigm of ownership of things, of objects and assets. And non-fungible tokens really deliver the internet of ownership, where you can have an owner piece of your digital experience, your digital life, your digital self. And by buying virtual land, it is just one example of such a representation. But the other thing that makes the metaverse so important, particularly for all in the gaming industry, is that actually what was needed outside this open infrastructure is now being developed. A kind of banking system that didn't really exist before. We all, of course, have virtual coins inside the game that helps sort of deal with a sort of fake economy that we have inside the ecosystem. But what we dubbed is called the bank of DeFi. You have billions of dollars essentially locked in protocols that are accessible in an open manner that essentially become the banking infrastructure for all of these new metaverses that are out there. And without them, the ability for you to own assets and to create value for them may not be as powerful. Just as we have an existing closed economic system inside games, because you don't have an open and transparent marketplace, and in fact, DeFi solves that as well. So, with non-fungible tokens, you have the objects and the assets and the things. And with DeFi and cryptocurrencies, you basically have a banking system that creates an economy. So, what is needed next? And this is what we think the future of games will definitely go towards is the construction of the DAO, a decentralized autonomous organization. What that really means is that the users who are the players inside your games actually become the owners of the game in some way. Kind of almost like a voting right or like a citizen. If you were within sort of your emerging country, that is in fact your game. In fact, we think metaverses inside games are like the construction of countries. When you consider the games that you're building today, you're about constructing communities. You are building a society, even if it is a small one, and creating value from that. And what happens with the centralized autonomous organizations is that it is no longer something that is controlled by a top-level down company. It is in fact something that the community can make their own voice votes. And because it's a blockchain, this contract exists forever. The moment that it gets issued on a public chain, it basically exists forever as it is on the blockchain and thereby unalterable. You see some of those results, where you see these combinations of the ownership of assets together with a banking and a governance system, for example, in the game Axie Infinity. In fact, they're the biggest blockchain game out there. And, in a place like the Philippines, people are earning between $250 or $500 a month playing a game. And while that may seem for traditional game developers maybe a little crazy, actually all it's really doing is rewarding the time and the creative network effect that these gamers do back to the people who contribute to that. But you needed a banking system and community ownership for that to be unlocked. We think gaming will be the future work, meaning that games in the future are not just going to be about fun. They certainly will continue to be fun and entertaining, but they perhaps are also the future for many of us in terms of its potential to make a living or have meaning and purpose, similar as we demonstrated in the example of the Philippines. Right now, there are more crypto wallets in rural Philippines than there is actually credit cards. So it's also created incredible financial inclusion as well. We think the industry is still relatively nascent in comparison. The idea of owning virtual assets is actually not crazy. There are a lot of assets being purchased inside online games today. If they're not on blockchain, for the most part you're actually renting them. We think of this as a virtual rental community, as sort of virtual rental environment right now inside all the games today. But that virtual rental environment is $100 billion a year and growing. And so, what happens when you take a rental community that has been renting for most of their life and actually give them ownership and the ability to own it and thereby the benefits of an ownership economy as opposed to one of the rental economy? We think the paradigm will shift and change, and the growth potential will be just as big, equivalently large, as we're going from rental to ownership in the physical world. Meaning, that is also the reason why assets grow in value, because now you can confirm the benefits of that ownership in terms of long-term yield, in terms of long-term ownership benefits. Just in the same way that when you buy a property, for instance, you want to consider the long-term benefits and therefore give it a future value because of the fact that you know that you can get a return from that. That's basically what is happening in the world of blockchain, gaming, and open metaverses. And we'll conclude essentially with this little image as a thought here, which is that many of the largest companies today know what the true and open metaverse is about, which is the one where we have ownership of our data, where we own our digital assets. And by owning our digital assets, we own basically our data and with that our freedom in the digital world. But that also means it's very different from the business models today where the network effect is not shared, where the network effect in fact is owned by the platform. Facebook today, for instance, despite them calling themselves Meta, owns our network effect entirely. And actually their business would be terribly disrupted if all of us suddenly had ownership. But think about it for a moment. In this world, should we not own our data? Should we not be paid for the value that we're giving to companies like Facebook? It is less about thinking about how we can take value from the players and make more money from them, but rather about what can we give back to the users for fair value in a kind of community and society where every game is an open and true metaverse, where the players can have real ownership of the assets and can have their freedoms and a vote in its future. With that said, we are already at the end of our video. If you liked our content and you want to see more videos like this, please give a like down below and consider to subscribe to our channel. Your Cryptocat-Guru.